Hey everyone, I'm the Olivia and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, I'd love to know in comments where you're from and what time it is when you're listening. Let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's story. I never thought I'd end up here in this tired old house at the edge of a town I could barely find on a map. Life has a funny way of throwing you curveballs like that. One day you're planning your anniversary dinner and the next you're signing divorce papers and packing your life into cardboard boxes. I didn't have much left when the dust settled. A car that was one oil change away from dying, some worn-out furniture, and a few keepsakes that I couldn't bear to throw away. The house wasn't much better. A two-story Victorian, hunched over like an old man leaning on a cane. It sat at the end of a narrow street lined with towering oaks. The yard was overgrown, the shutters hung crooked, and the paint peeled in long curling strips like sunburned skin. But it was cheap. Dirt cheap. When I first saw the listing online, I thought it was a mistake. A whole house for less than most people paid for a studio apartment. I called the number immediately, half expecting the landlord to laugh at me or tell me the house had already been rented. Instead, he sounded eager, almost relieved, as he told me I could move in that weekend if I wanted. The day I arrived, he met me at the front gate. A wiry man with a faded baseball cap and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll love it," he said, handing me the keys. "It's got character." Character. I'd heard that before. It usually meant falling apart. But I wasn't in a position to be picky. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. A faint, musty odor like wet wood and old books. The floors creaked under my feet, each step sounding like a groan of protest. The walls were a dingy off-white, covered in cracks that spiderwebbed up to the ceiling. The furniture the landlord had left behind was mismatched and worn, but functional. A sagging couch in the living room, a scratched dining table, and a bed frame that looked like it had seen better decades. I told myself it wasn't so bad. With a little cleaning and a few personal touches, I could make it feel like home. The first night was unsettling. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to the place yet. Every noise seemed magnified in the stillness of the house. The floorboards creaked as if someone were pacing in the next room. The radiator in my bedroom hissed and clanked, the sound sharp enough to make me jump. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint tapping noise like fingers drumming on glass. When I went to check the windows, they were all closed and locked. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just the house settling. That's what old houses did, right? They groaned and shifted and made weird noises. It was nothing to worry about. I spent the next few days unpacking and getting settled. The neighbors kept their distance, though a few of them nodded politely when I passed them on the street. One woman, a middle-aged redhead with a nervous smile, stopped to introduce herself. Her name was Joan and she lived 3 doors down. "You're brave," she said, glancing toward my house. I frowned. Brave? She hesitated, like she was debating whether to say more. Finally, she shook her head. "Never mind. It's just, that place has a bit of a history. You know how small towns are. Rumors, stories, nothing to worry about." I laughed, though it sounded forced even to my ears. "What kind of stories?" Joan shifted uncomfortably. "Oh, you know, people saying they heard things, saw things. I'm sure it's just nonsense. It's an old house, it creaks, it groans. That's all." Her words stuck with me long after she walked away. That night, the noises started again. The tapping on the windows, faint and rhythmic. The groaning floorboards, as if someone was walking back and forth just outside my bedroom door. I stayed in bed, clutching the blankets and telling myself it was nothing. The next morning, I decided to distract myself by cleaning out the attic. The landlord had mentioned there were a few boxes up there that belonged to previous tenants, and I figured it would be a good way to kill a few hours. The attic was cramped and dusty, with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling that cast long, flickering shadows. Most of the boxes were filled with junk. Old clothes, broken toys, yellowed newspapers. But one box, shoved into a corner, caught my eye. It was smaller than the others, and the cardboard was worn and faded as if it had been there for decades. Inside, I found a collection of strange items. A leather-bound journal with brittle, yellowed pages. A handful of photographs, their edges curled with age. And a small, intricately carved wooden box that was locked tight. The journal was the first thing I examined. The handwriting inside was spidery and uneven, the ink faded to a dull brown. The entries were dated, though the years didn't make sense. 1924. 1925. The house wasn't even that old, was it? Most of the entries were mundane, detailing the daily life of someone named Thomas. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone of the writing changed. Thomas began describing strange occurrences in the house. Footsteps in the middle of the night, whispers coming from empty rooms, the feeling of being watched. One entry, dated October 13, 1925, sent a chill down my spine. Asterisk, there is something here. I feel it watching me, its presence heavy and cold. I hear its footsteps at night, pacing the halls. I've tried to speak to it, to banish it, but it won't leave. It grows stronger every day. I am afraid. I set the journal down, my hands shaking. The photographs were just as unsettling. They showed the house in various states of disrepair, with shadowy figures lurking in the background. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the more I looked, the more convinced I became that the figures were real. The wooden box was the last thing I examined. I tried to open it, but the lock wouldn't budge. When I shook it, I heard something rattling inside. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. The journal was probably just fiction, written by someone with an overactive imagination. The photographs were old and blurry, hardly proof of anything supernatural. And the noises in the house? Just the natural creaks and groans of an aging structure. But as night fell, my unease grew. I was lying in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too loud to be the house settling. They started at the far end of the hall and moved slowly toward my bedroom. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. I wanted to get up, to open the door and prove to myself that there was nothing there. But I couldn't move. It was as if an invisible weight was pressing down on me, holding me in place. The doorknob rattled. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I decided to visit the local library to see if I could learn anything about the house's history. The librarian, a kind woman in her 60s, helped me dig through old records and newspapers. What I found made my stomach drop. The house had been built in 1923 by a man named Thomas Carr, who was rumored to have an interest in the occult. According to the articles, Thomas had hosted seances and rituals in the house, claiming he could communicate with spirits. In 1925, he disappeared without a trace. Subsequent owners reported strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, voices in the night, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Some had even fled the house in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. I left the library with a stack of photocopied articles and a growing sense of unease. When I got home, the house felt different. Colder. Darker. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I noticed something strange. The door to the attic, which I had closed earlier, was wide open. The attic door shouldn't have been open. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up at the dark gap where the door hung ajar. My throat tightened and my heart thudded painfully against my ribs. I hadn't been in the attic since the day I'd found the journal, and I was sure I had closed the door afterward. A dozen rational explanations rushed through my mind. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe the wind had somehow pushed it open. But I knew deep down that neither of those explanations made sense. There were no drafts in this house, and the latch had clicked firmly into place when I closed it. I told myself to go upstairs and check, but my feet refused to move. I stood frozen at the base of the staircase, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then I heard it. A faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. It came from the attic. I backed away, shaking my head. Nope. No way. My voice sounded small and shaky in the empty hallway. Grabbing my coat, I left the house, locking the door behind me. I needed air. I needed to get out of there, even if it was just for a little while. The cold evening wind felt like a slap to the face as I stepped outside. The sky was a deep, bruised gray, and the sun was already sinking below the horizon. I wandered aimlessly down the street, trying to shake the unease that clung to me like a second skin. As I turned a corner, I spotted Joan, the neighbor who had warned me about the house. She was tending to the small garden in front of her house, pulling weeds from the flower beds. "Hi," I called out, forcing a smile. She straightened up and gave me a cautious look. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "It's the house. There's something weird going on." Her expression darkened. She wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for me to come closer. What kind of weird? I told her about the noises, the attic door, and the journal I'd found. I left out the part about the footsteps outside my bedroom door. I didn't want to sound crazy. Joan listened intently, her brows knitting together. When I finished, she let out a long sigh. You need to be careful, she said, her voice low. That house, it's not like other houses. People have tried to live there before and it never ends well. What do you mean? I asked, my stomach nodding. She glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. There's something in that house. Something dark. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't want anyone there. Every tenant who's ever moved in has left within a few months. Some just vanish. Others leave screaming about things they've seen or heard. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Do you believe them? Joan hesitated. I don't know. I've never seen anything myself, but I've heard things. At night, when it's quiet, I've heard screams coming from the house. And once I saw a man run out of there in the middle of the night, barefoot and terrified. He was babbling about something watching him. I swallowed hard. Why didn't anyone tell me this before I moved in? Would you have believed us? She asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't have an answer for that. Joan sighed and placed a hand on my arm. Look, if things get too bad, you're welcome to stay here for a night or two. But if I were you, I'd leave while I still can. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed her. As much as I hated to admit it, the house was all I could afford right now. I couldn't just pack up and leave. When I returned home, the attic door was closed. I stared at it for a long time, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Finally, I forced myself to open it and peer inside. The attic was just as I'd left it, dusty, cluttered, and silent. The wooden box with the locked lid still sat in the corner, untouched. I closed the door again, this time jamming a chair under the handle for good measure. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house breathe around me. The usual noises, the creaking floorboards, the hissing radiator, sounded louder than usual, as if the house were trying to get my attention. I was almost asleep when I felt it. The mattress dipped as if someone had sat down on the edge of the bed. My eyes flew open and my breath caught in my throat. The room was dark, but I could just make out the shape of the bedspread, bunched up where the weight pressed down. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The weight shifted, sliding closer to me. I felt the cold brush of air against my cheek, like someone exhaling. My pulse was a thunderstorm in my ears. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the bedside lamp. My fingers fumbled for the switch, and when the light finally flicked on, the room was empty. The bedspread was smooth and undisturbed. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I decided to confront the house head-on. If there was something here, some spirit or presence, I needed to know what it wanted. I retrieved the journal from the attic and began reading it more closely, searching for any mention of what Thomas Carr had done in the house. The later entries were the most disturbing. Thomas described conducting rituals to open a doorway to the spirit world, though he didn't explain why. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadowy figures, and feeling an oppressive, malevolent presence. One entry, written just days before his disappearance, stood out. Asterisk, the doorway is open, but I fear I've made a grave mistake. Something has come through, something I cannot control. It watches me, it whispers to me, and I feel its anger. It does not belong in this world, and it wants to be free. The words sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know what to do. Leaving the house felt like admitting defeat, but staying felt dangerous. As I sat there trying to make sense of everything, the lights flickered. And then the footsteps started again. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and heavy, echoing through the house like a countdown. I froze, clutching the journal in my lap. The sound came from the hallway outside the living room, each step creaking closer. My throat tightened as I stared at the doorway, expecting to see someone, or something, emerge. But nothing did. The footsteps stopped, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my body tense and my mind racing. Finally, I forced myself to move, clutching the journal like a shield as I crept toward the hallway. Hello. My voice sounded small and hollow in the stillness. No answer. The hallway was empty, but the air felt colder than before, heavy and oppressive. I could feel it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the direction of the attic. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave the house and never come back. But something about the whisper drew me in. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a pull, like an invisible hand guiding me toward the source. The attic door was still closed, the chair wedged firmly under the handle. But the whispering continued, growing louder as I approached. Taking a deep breath, I removed the chair and opened the door. The attic was darker than usual, the single bulb flickering weakly. Shadows pooled in the corners, stretching and twisting like living things. The whispering stopped. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The journal was still in my hand, the pages trembling as I flipped through them. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Some kind of answer maybe, or a clue that would explain what was happening. And then I saw it. The wooden box. It sat in the same corner where I'd left it, its intricate carvings gleaming faintly in the dim light. But now it felt different, like it was radiating a faint hum of energy. I knelt in front of it, my hands trembling as I traced the carvings with my fingertips. They were strange and intricate, forming a pattern that reminded me of the sigils I'd seen in the journal. The lock was still intact, but the box felt lighter, as if whatever had been inside was no longer there. Suddenly, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. Asterisk, open it. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The voice was clear now, deep and resonant, echoing through the attic like a command. Asterisk, open it. I can't, I whispered, shaking my head. It's locked. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. The air in the attic felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. I could feel it crawling across my skin, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. Without thinking, I grabbed the box and ran downstairs, slamming the attic door shut behind me. I spent the rest of the day in the living room, staring at the box and flipping through the journal. The more I read, the more convinced I became that the box was the key to whatever was happening in the house. One of the final entries described a ritual Thomas Carr had performed, using the box as a conduit to communicate with the other side. He wrote about hearing voices, seeing shadows, and feeling the presence of something he called the Watcher. Asterisk, the Watcher is not of this world, he wrote. It does not belong here. I tried to send it back, but the doorway remains open. It watches, it waits, and it feeds on fear. The words sent a chill down my spine. As night fell, I could feel the house changing again. The temperature dropped, and the shadows grew darker, stretching across the walls like grasping hands. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the box and the journal, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. And then the lights went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, using the flashlight to cut through the gloom. That's when I saw it. A shadow darker than the rest, standing at the far end of the room. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and piercing. Who's there? I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Slowly, it began to move, gliding across the room toward me. I backed away, clutching the journal and the box like talismans. The shadow stopped a few feet away, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. And then it spoke. Asterisk, you opened the door. Its voice was low and guttural, reverberating through the room. I didn't open anything, I stammered, my back pressing against the wall. The shadow loomed closer, its presence filling the room. Asterisk, the door is open. You must close it. How? I asked, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it began to dissolve, melting into the darkness around it. And then I was alone. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terror and confusion. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The house was alive with noise. Footsteps in the hall, whispers in the walls, and the faint sound of something scratching at the attic door. By morning, I had made up my mind. I needed to know the truth about the house and the rituals Thomas Carr had performed. I needed to find a way to close the door. Morning brought little comfort. The weak sunlight barely penetrated the gloom inside the house, and every shadow felt like it was watching me. I hadn't slept, and my body ached with exhaustion, but adrenaline kept me moving. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them sitting here. After a quick internet search, I found the address of the town's library. It was only a short walk away, a modest brick building nestled between a post office and a diner. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes behind thick glasses, gave me a polite smile as I approached the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm looking for information about a house," I said, hesitating. The one on 82 Elm Street. Her smile faltered. She glanced at me over her glasses, her expression unreadable. That's an old house, she said slowly. What kind of information are you looking for? Anything you have, I said. Previous owners, history of the property, maybe news articles. The librarian studied me for a moment, then nodded. Give me a moment. She disappeared into the back, leaving me alone in the quiet library. The air smelled faintly of old paper and dust, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of pages. When she returned, she was carrying a stack of files and a yellowed newspaper. She set them on the counter with a heavy sigh. This is what I could find, she said. Be warned, though, there's not much that's pleasant in here. I thanked her and carried the materials to a nearby table. The files contained records of the house's previous owners, starting with Thomas Carr. According to the documents, Carr had purchased the house in the early 1900s and lived there for several years before his disappearance. After that, the house changed hands multiple times, but most owners didn't stay for more than a few months. One file contained police reports about unexplained disturbances, neighbors reporting screams, strange lights, and mysterious figures seen in the windows. The reports were vague and inconclusive, but they painted a clear picture. Something was wrong with the house. The newspaper was even more unsettling. The headline read, "Local man vanishes without a trace." The article described how Thomas Carr had been last seen entering the house late one night. A neighbor reported hearing strange noises and seeing unnatural lights coming from the house shortly afterward. When police investigated, they found no sign of Carr, only a disturbing scene in the attic. Strange symbols drawn on the walls in what appeared to be ash, and the wooden box sitting in the center of the room. I shivered as I read the article. The description of the attic matched what I'd seen, down to the carvings on the box. Flipping through the files, I found another article from years later. This one described a couple who had lived in the house briefly before fleeing in the middle of the night. According to their account, they had heard voices, seen shadowy figures, and experienced inexplicable cold spots. The last sentence caught my attention. The couple claimed that the house was cursed, its foundations built on something evil. They described seeing a shadowy figure they called the Watcher, which seemed to grow stronger the longer they stayed. The Watcher. The word sent a chill down my spine. I remembered what the shadow in my house had said. The door is open. You must close it. What door? And how was I supposed to close it? I left the library with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Thomas Carr had done something in that house. Something that had unleashed a force he couldn't control. And now it was my problem. When I returned home, the house felt different. The air was heavy and still, as if it were holding its breath. The shadows seemed darker, deeper, and the faint smell of ash lingered in the air. I set the files and newspaper on the kitchen table and pulled out the journal. I'd read most of it already, but I needed to go through it again more carefully this time. The later entries were the most revealing. Carr wrote about his experiments with the occult, his attempts to communicate with entities beyond the veil, and his growing obsession with opening a doorway to the other side. One entry stood out. The box is the key. It holds the power to open the doorway, but it must be used carefully. The symbols must be drawn correctly, the incantations spoken precisely. Any mistake could have disastrous consequences. Another entry, written shortly before his disappearance, was even more chilling. The Watcher grows stronger with each passing day. It feeds on fear, on despair. I can feel it watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I must send it back before it's too late. I stared at the words, my mind racing. If the box was the key, then maybe it could also be the solution. But how was I supposed to use it? The answer, I realized, was probably in the symbols and incantations Carr had mentioned. That night, I forced myself to go back into the attic. The air was colder up there and the faint smell of ash was stronger. The wooden box sat in its usual spot, the carvings on its surface seeming to shimmer in the dim light. I knelt beside it, clutching the journal in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The journal contained sketches of the symbols Carr had drawn during his rituals, along with fragments of the incantations he had used. I studied them carefully, tracing the lines with my finger. The symbols were intricate, almost hypnotic, and I could feel a strange energy radiating from them. As I worked, the house creaked and groaned around me as if it were alive. The whispering started again, faint and insistent, growing louder with each passing moment. And then I felt it, the cold brush of air against my neck, the sensation of being watched. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. A shadow stood at the edge of the attic, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. "The door is open," it said, its voice low and guttural. "I know," I whispered, clutching the journal tighter. "I'm going to close it." The shadow didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching as I began to draw the symbols on the attic floor. My hands trembled as I worked, the whispering growing louder and more chaotic. It felt like the house was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. But I kept going, determined to finish what Carr had started. The attic felt alive. The air was thick and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your teeth ache. The shadows clung to the corners like living things, pulsing and shifting with every flicker of the weak bulb above me. The journal sat open beside me, its pages trembling in the draftless air. I knelt on the floor, chalk in hand, tracing the intricate symbols Thomas Carr had sketched decades ago. They weren't just drawings. They were deliberate, purposeful, charged with a strange energy that I could feel vibrating beneath my fingertips. The whispering was louder now, a cacophony of voices overlapping, too many to distinguish. My heart pounded as I worked, each stroke of chalk feeling like a countdown to something I couldn't fully understand. As I finished the last symbol, the temperature in the attic dropped even further, and the bulb overhead flickered violently. The symbols on the floor seemed to glow faintly, a dull, eerie light that didn't seem to come from the bulb. And then everything went still. The whispering stopped. The light stabilized. The house held its breath. For a brief moment I thought it was over. I was wrong. The floor beneath me shuddered, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house. The symbols on the floor flared brighter, their glow now an angry, pulsating red. The wooden box, which I had placed in the center of the symbols, began to tremble. Its carvings seemed to shift, the patterns rearranging themselves in ways that made my stomach turn. And then, with a deafening crack, the box burst open. I stumbled back, shielding my face as a gust of icy wind erupted from the box. The wind carried with it a smell of decay, of damp earth and something metallic. When I looked up, the attic was no longer empty. The Watcher was here. It stood at the edge of the symbols, a towering figure of shadow and smoke. Its form was constantly shifting, tendrils of darkness curling and writhing around it. But its eyes, two pinpoints of pale, flickering light, were fixed on me. "You dare to summon me?" it hissed, its voice a guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I didn't summon you," I stammered, backing away. "I'm trying to send you back." The Watcher laughed, a low, chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "You cannot send me back. The doorway is open and I am free." "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "The doorway is still here and I'll close it. You don't belong in this world." The Watcher's eyes flared, and the temperature in the attic plummeted even further. Frost began to creep across the floor, covering the symbols and the wooden box in a thin layer of ice. "You are weak," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. "You do not understand the forces you are dealing with." "I understand enough," I shot back, clutching the journal. "You feed on fear, on despair. But I'm not afraid of you." The Watcher's form shifted, growing taller, its tendrils of shadow reaching toward me. "Liar," it hissed. The house groaned around us, the walls trembling as the Watcher's presence filled the space. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me, trying to crush my will. But I refused to give in. Gripping the journal tightly, I began to recite the incantation Thomas Carr had written in his final entry. The words felt foreign and heavy on my tongue, but I forced them out, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. The Watcher roared, a sound of pure rage that shook the walls and sent shards of plaster raining down from the ceiling. Its tendrils lashed out, but they couldn't cross the boundary of the symbols on the floor. The incantation seemed to have an effect. The red glow of the symbols intensified, and the Watcher's form began to waver, its edges blurring and dissolving like smoke in the wind. "You cannot banish me," it screamed, its voice a mix of fury and desperation. "I am eternal. I am." Before it could finish, I shouted the final words of the incantation. The symbols on the floor flared brilliantly, their light blinding. The watcher let out one last bone-chilling scream as its form was pulled toward the wooden box, which had begun to glow with the same intense light. There was a deafening crack and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the attic was empty. The wooden box lay in the center of the floor, its carvings now dark and lifeless. The symbols I had drawn were gone, their outlines barely visible beneath a thin layer of ash. I sat there for a long time, trembling and trying to catch my breath. I didn't sleep that night. The house was eerily quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The watcher was gone, I was sure of it, but the air in the house still felt wrong. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't care about breaking my lease or losing my deposit. I just needed to get out of that house, to put as much distance between myself and whatever lingering darkness still clung to its walls. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, silent and imposing, its windows dark and uninviting. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the attic window. A flicker of movement, a shadow shifting. I didn't look back again. Even though I left the house behind, its presence followed me. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. After all, it wasn't every day that you banished a shadowy entity from your attic. The tension of those days lingered in my chest like a bruise, tender and unyielding. But as the miles stretched between me and 82 Elm Street, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The first night in my new apartment, a simple one-bedroom unit on the edge of town, should have brought relief. I had chosen the place on impulse, opting for something modern and sterile. No history, no charm, just clean white walls and functional appliances. I didn't unpack much. Most of my belongings were still stuffed into hastily packed boxes. I only pulled out the essentials. A change of clothes, my phone charger, and a blanket to drape over the cheap mattress I'd bought on the way. I tried to convince myself that I was safe now. The watcher was gone, sealed away in that cursed house. But as I lay in bed, staring at the blank ceiling, the familiar sounds returned. It started with a faint creak like the floorboards settling. I told myself it was the neighbors upstairs. Then came the whispering. It wasn't loud, barely more than the rustle of leaves in the wind, but it was unmistakable. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest. "Hello." My voice was hoarse, trembling. The whispering stopped. I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the room with a harsh yellow glow. The corner was empty, the shadows banished by the light. For the rest of the night, I kept every light in the apartment on. The next day, I tried to shake off the experience as a bad dream. Exhaustion had been playing tricks on me, I reasoned. But the tension in my chest remained, a constant reminder of what I had escaped, or thought I had escaped. I went about my day in a daze, trying to settle into my new life. I found a nearby cafe and spent hours there, sipping coffee and scrolling aimlessly through my phone, avoiding the thought of going back to the apartment. When I finally did return, it was dusk. The long shadows of the setting sun stretched across the walls, and I hesitated at the door, my keys clutched tightly in my hand. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, unlocking the door and stepping inside. The apartment was just as I had left it, stark and uninviting with unopened boxes stacked against the walls. But the air felt different, heavier. I told myself it was just my imagination as I moved through the apartment, turning on every light. The brightness helped, but only a little. I ordered takeout for dinner, eating mechanically as I scrolled through social media, trying to distract myself. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my eyes kept drifting to the shadows at the edges of the room. It wasn't until I heard the knock at the door that I realized how tense I was. The sound startled me, sharp and unexpected. I set my phone down and approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Another knock came, louder this time. I yanked the door open, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the dimly lit corridor, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But as I closed the door and turned back toward the living room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, standing in the corner. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. "No," I whispered, backing away. "You're not real. You're not here." The shadow shifted, stretching toward me. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice low and guttural, the same voice I had heard in the attic. My legs gave out and I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table for support. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't answer. It simply stood there watching as the lights in the apartment flickered and dimmed. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. The street was empty, the silence oppressive. I knew I couldn't go back inside. Not yet. Instead, I found myself driving aimlessly, the streets blurring together as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Had I really banished the Watcher? Or had I only made it angrier? The journal, the incantation, the symbols, they had all seemed to work. But now, doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I didn't know where I was going until I pulled into the parking lot of a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for that. The room was shabby but clean, and I locked the door behind me before collapsing onto the bed. Sleep came in fits and starts, plagued by dreams of shadows and whispers. When I woke, the whispers followed me. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me from the motel to my car, clinging to the edges of my consciousness like a persistent fog. At first, they were faint, easily dismissed as the remnants of a nightmare. But as the day wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. Even in the bright light of morning, I felt the weight of unseen eyes on me. It was as if the shadows themselves had become sentient, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I couldn't stay in the motel forever. I knew that much. I needed answers, and there was only one place I could think to look: the house. Driving back to 82 Elm Street felt like a death march. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as though the house was already aware of my return. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the darkened windows. The house loomed over me, its weathered exterior seeming more sinister than I remembered. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The Watcher was gone, banished. Whatever I was experiencing now had to be some kind of after effect, a lingering paranoia. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The front door creaked ominously as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the empty house. The air inside was stale and cold, carrying that faint, familiar scent of ash. I moved through the house cautiously, my footsteps loud in the oppressive silence. Everything was exactly as I had left it: dusty furniture, unopened boxes, and that pervasive sense of dread that seemed to seep from the walls. My destination was clear. The attic door felt heavier this time, the wooden ladder creaking under my weight as I climbed up. The attic was just as cold as I remembered, the dim light casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The wooden box sat in its usual place, its surface dark and lifeless. I approached it cautiously, half expecting it to spring open again. But it remained still, as inert as a piece of old furniture. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the empty space. The air seemed to shift, the shadows deepening. "You cannot undo what has been done," a voice said, low and guttural. I spun around, my heart pounding. The Watcher was there, its form a mass of writhing darkness at the edge of the attic. My voice faltered. "I banished you. You're gone." The Watcher's laugh was a sound that made my skin crawl. "You cannot banish me. I am bound to this house, to the doorway you failed to close." "I didn't fail," I said, clutching the journal tighter. "I followed the ritual. I sealed the doorway." The Watcher's form shifted, its tendrils reaching toward me. "You sealed nothing. You merely delayed the inevitable." I took a step back, my mind racing. The symbols, the incantation, they should have worked. So why was the Watcher still here? "You feed on fear," I said, my voice steadier now. "That's what Thomas Carr wrote in his journal. You're not as strong as you want me to believe." The Watcher's eyes flared, twin points of pale light that seemed to pierce through me. "You know nothing of strength," it hissed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a piece of chalk, the same one I had used during the ritual. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, kneeling to redraw the symbols on the attic floor. The Watcher roared, the sound shaking the walls. "Foolish mortal. You cannot contain me." But I ignored its threats, my hands steady as I worked. The symbols glowed faintly as I traced their intricate patterns, the air around me growing colder with each passing second. "You think you can defy me?" the Watcher snarled, its form surging toward me. The moment it crossed the boundary of the first symbol, the light flared brightly, forcing it back. I kept going, reciting the incantation from memory. The words felt heavy and foreign on my tongue, but I poured every ounce of willpower into them, refusing to falter. The Watcher thrashed against the barrier, its roars filling the attic. But the symbols held, their light growing brighter with each word I spoke. As I finished the incantation, the attic fell silent. The watcher's form wavered, its edges dissolving like smoke in the wind. For a brief moment, its eyes met mine, and I saw something I hadn't expected: fear. "No," it screamed, its voice a mix of rage and desperation. "You cannot." Before it could finish, the symbols flared one last time, their light blinding. And then it was gone. The attic was empty. I didn't wait to see if the watcher would return. I grabbed the wooden box and the journal and fled the house, not stopping until I was back in my car. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The house was cursed, that much was clear. And as long as it stood, the doorway would remain, waiting for someone else to open it. As I drove away, I made a decision. I couldn't let that happen. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. My thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm, anchored by one singular, unrelenting idea. The house had to be destroyed. It wasn't just about me anymore. As long as the house stood, it would remain a doorway, a beacon for the darkness that lurked beyond. Someone else could stumble into its trap, another unsuspecting soul drawn to its cheap rent and crumbling charm. I couldn't let that happen. The next day, I returned to 82 Elm Street with a plan. I parked a few streets away and walked the rest of the way, my heart hammering with every step. My bag felt heavy on my shoulder, its contents rattling softly: a canister of gasoline, matches, and a flashlight. The house loomed ahead, its shadow stretching across the overgrown yard. It felt alive, as though it was watching me, waiting to see what I would do. I hesitated at the front door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. For a moment, I thought I heard the faintest whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Leave." I shook it off and pushed the door open. The air inside was colder than before, the kind of cold that made my breath fog in front of me. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive, as though they were crowding in around me. I didn't let myself think too much. If I stopped to consider what I was about to do, I might lose my nerve. I moved quickly, splashing gasoline across the floors and walls. The scent was sharp and acrid, stinging my nose and making my eyes water. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant groan of the house, made my pulse spike. I kept expecting the watcher to appear, to step out of the shadows and stop me. But the house remained silent, as if it too was holding its breath. When I reached the attic, the air grew even colder. The wooden box still sat in the center of the floor, its carvings dark and lifeless. I hesitated, staring at it. Part of me wanted to take it, to study it further, to try and understand the forces at work. But I knew better. The box was a tether, a link to the darkness that plagued the house. If I took it with me, I might never truly escape. Instead, I doused it in gasoline, watching as the liquid seeped into the wood. "You can't stop this," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "This ends here." I stood in the front yard, a box of matches in my hand, as the house loomed before me. For a moment I hesitated. It felt wrong, destroying a piece of history, even one as cursed as this. But then I thought of the watcher, of the darkness that had nearly consumed me, and my resolve hardened. I struck a match and watched the tiny flame flicker in the cool night air. With a deep breath, I tossed it onto the porch. The gasoline ignited instantly, flames racing across the wood and climbing up the walls. The fire spread quickly, consuming the house in a roaring inferno. For a moment I thought I heard a scream, a low, guttural wail that rose above the crackling flames. But it might have been the wind, or the fire itself, twisting and groaning as it devoured the old structure. I stood there for what felt like hours, watching the house burn. When the fire finally died, all that remained was a smoldering skeleton of charred wood and ash. I walked away without looking back. The next few days passed in a haze. The fire was ruled an accident, faulty wiring in an old house. No one questioned it, and I didn't volunteer any information. I should have felt relief. The house was gone, the doorway closed. But the whispers, they didn't stop. The first time I heard them again, I was sitting in my apartment, staring blankly at the television. They were faint, almost imperceptible, like a soft breeze rustling the leaves. But I knew what they were. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, heavier, as though they were watching me. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, a lingering trauma from my time in the house. But deep down I knew the truth. The watcher wasn't bound to the house. It was bound to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. At first, I thought it was just the aftermath of everything that had happened. Weeks of sleepless nights, the echo of those horrible experiences at the house still ringing in my ears. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent the sensation became. It wasn't just that something was watching me. It was that something was with me. At work, I kept feeling it, the weight of invisible eyes on my back. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to amplify the silence in the office, my every breath too loud. I couldn't focus on my tasks. The screen in front of me blurred, and the clack of the keyboard sounded distorted as though I was hearing it from underwater. I pushed through it, trying to act normal, but inside I was falling apart. The first real sign that something was wrong came in the middle of the night. I woke up to the sensation of cold fingers brushing against my face. My eyes snapped open. The room was bathed in darkness, and for a moment I thought I was dreaming. But the feeling didn't fade. I reached up, feeling the icy air against my skin where nothing should have been. That's when I heard it. A whisper, low and guttural, a voice I recognized all too well. "You can't escape." I jerked back, my heart thundering in my chest. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the light switch. The room illuminated, the harsh light making the shadows retreat into the corners. The air was still cold though. Too cold. I looked around the room, my eyes darting over every surface. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the watcher, or whatever it was, win. I packed a bag that night, too frantic to think clearly. I grabbed my essentials, clothes, my phone, a few toiletries, but left everything else behind. It didn't matter. I couldn't stay in this apartment anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to escape. But no matter where I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and the house on Elm Street, the whispers followed. I checked into another motel, but the feeling didn't fade. The darkness in the room seemed to cling to me, growing heavier with every passing second. The whispers crawled into my mind when I tried to sleep, filling the silence with words I couldn't quite understand but that made my skin crawl nonetheless. "Leave this place," they whispered. "Leave this place or we'll come for you." The next day I found myself standing in front of a library, the place where I had spent hours researching the house and its history. My hands shook as I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cool, air-conditioned breeze was a relief, and the smell of books and wood calmed my nerves somewhat. But the unease gnawed at me, the familiar whispers swirling at the back of my mind. I approached the librarian, an older woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up, smiling politely. "How can I help you?" she asked. "I need to find information about a house," I said, my voice trembling. 82 Elm Street. "Do you have anything on its history?" Her smile faltered, and her eyes darted to the side as if she were considering something. Then with a sigh she nodded. "There's a section in the back. We have a few old records and news clippings. But be warned, the history of that house isn't pretty." I followed her down a narrow aisle to a dusty shelf where the old records were stored. The librarian left me to it, but I could feel her watchful eyes on my back as I scanned the rows of brittle paper. After what felt like hours, I found what I was looking for. An old newspaper clipping from decades ago, yellowed with age, detailing a fire at 82 Elm Street. The article was brief, just a few sentences, but it mentioned a family who had lived there. Asterisk the Carr family star. The fire had killed several people, but the article didn't go into detail about who exactly had died. It was only a passing mention, lost in the sea of similar stories about house fires and accidents. But something about the name Carr struck me. It felt important. I continued digging through the records, finding more references to the Carr family. They had lived in the house for years, and the last record I found was a police report from the mid-1980s. It detailed the bizarre disappearance of Thomas Carr, the last known occupant of the house. The report mentioned strange behavior in the days leading up to his disappearance, muttering about curses and rituals, drawing strange symbols on the walls of the house. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the report. It was clear now. The watcher wasn't just a random entity. It had been tied to the house for generations, waiting for someone to open the door again. And I had been that someone. That night, I returned to the motel, the weight of the information I had uncovered pressing down on me. The whispers were louder now, persistent and maddening. I could hear them in my mind, in my bones. "Leave this place." I tried to ignore them, but they didn't stop. They filled the room, crawling under my skin, suffocating me. And then there it was. Sound footsteps. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I wasn't alone. The door to my motel room creaked open slowly, inch by inch, the rusted hinges protesting. I was paralyzed, my body frozen in terror as the shadows in the room deepened. The door swung wide and I saw it. The Watcher. It stood in the doorway, its form shifting and writhing in the dim light. Its eyes gleamed with cold malice, and its voice echoed in my head louder than before. You cannot escape. Not now. Not ever. I could feel my pulse racing in my ears as I stared at the Watcher, its form flickering and shifting in the doorway. The shadows wrapped around it like living tendrils, clinging to its twisted shape. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. My throat tightened, suffocating on the words I couldn't find. This is it. The thought hung in my mind like a death sentence. After everything, the fire, the escape, the whispers, it had all led to this moment. The Watcher was here in the flesh, or whatever passed for it, and I knew deep down that there was no running from it. Not anymore. Its hollow black eyes fixed on me, and the whispers in my head grew louder, crawling through my thoughts like worms burrowing under my skin. You tried to close the door, the Watcher's voice rumbled, its tone mocking, low and guttural. You tried to stop me, but you failed. I took a step back, my feet heavy as though the floor had turned to quicksand beneath me. The shadows twisted and danced along the walls, growing longer, more sinister. My mind was spinning, overwhelmed with the sensation that I was trapped in an endless void. I didn't fail, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I closed the door. You should have stayed gone. The Watcher's form swelled, expanding like a dark storm cloud, and it let out a laugh, a deep, bone-chilling sound that reverberated through my body. You think it's that simple, it sneered. You can't close the door. The door is always open. The house is the doorway. It was never just a house, and it was never just my house. I stumbled backward, feeling my legs weaken as the Watcher's voice twisted and curled around me like a snake. There's always a price, the Watcher continued, its words curling into my mind like smoke. You thought you could banish me, but the price has already been paid. You're mine now. I felt a coldness wrap around my chest, the room growing darker with each passing second. The air grew thick, suffocating. I gasped for breath, but it felt like something was pressing on my chest. Please, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just wanted to be free. The Watcher's form shifted again, its darkness swallowing the room. It loomed larger, towering over me, the whispers now a constant hum in my ears. There is no freedom, it hissed. You have only delayed the inevitable. You've opened the door, and now you will be its keeper. Suddenly, the air grew even colder, and I felt something touch my shoulder, icy fingers brushing against my skin. My breath hitched in my throat as a wave of panic swept over me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The Watcher was gone. For a moment, I thought I was alone again. But then I heard it. A voice, familiar, comforting. Asterisk, you can escape, asterisk. I whipped around, my heart thundering in my chest. I hadn't imagined that. The voice came again, more insistent this time. Asterisk, you can escape the curse. It's not too late. You have the power, asterisk. I blinked, trying to process what I was hearing. The shadows had receded slightly, but the coldness remained, clinging to the air. It was the voice of the woman from the library, the librarian. But how could that be? She couldn't have been here. She was miles away. Asterisk, how? Asterisk, I whispered, desperate. How do I escape? There was a long silence. Then the voice spoke again, slower now, as if the very act of speaking was draining it. Asterisk, destroy the box. It binds you to the house. It binds you to the Watcher. Without it, you can be free, asterisk. The words felt like a revelation, like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. My hand instinctively reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the edges of the journal and the small wooden box, the very thing that had started it all. I had it with me. I had brought it from the house, unsure of what to do with it. But now I knew. I had to destroy it. I ran to the motel room's small kitchenette, grabbing a knife from the drawer. My hands were shaking as I pulled the box from my bag, the weight of it pressing down on me. I felt the coldness seep through my fingers as I held it, the darkness surrounding it like a living thing. I knew the Watcher was watching me. He was always watching. But I didn't care anymore. I took the knife in both hands and brought it down with all my strength. The blade sank into the wood with a sickening crack, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. The box shuddered, and for a brief moment I thought I saw the shadows in the corners of the room twitch, like something was trying to reach out to stop me. I ignored it, kept going. I cut deeper, carving through the intricate designs on the surface, the lines of the symbols that had bound the watcher to the house. With one final forceful strike, the box splintered open and a wave of freezing cold air rushed out. The room flickered, the shadows recoiling from the light. For a moment everything went still. Then the darkness began to lift. The oppressive feeling that had settled over the room slowly started to fade, like a fog retreating from the edges of my mind. The weight that had been pressing on my chest lifted and I could breathe again. I stared at the broken pieces of the box in my hands, feeling a strange sense of finality. It was over. But just as I began to relax, I heard it. The faintest whisper, low and breathless. Asterisk, you cannot escape, asterisk. It was a promise. The whisper echoed in my mind, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I froze, my heart stuttering in my chest. The room was still, the shadows now retreating, but the feeling of something else, something invisible, lingered. I turned around quickly, expecting to see the watcher again, its dark form looming at the edge of my vision. But there was nothing there. I blinked, trying to steady my breath. I had destroyed the box. I had broken it. I should have been free. But the voice had come from somewhere else. The curse, it was still alive, still waiting. I dropped the pieces of the broken box into the trash, my hands shaking as I moved. My mind was a storm of confusion and dread. It felt like a dream, but I knew it wasn't. Asterisk, I had closed the door. I had destroyed the source, asterisk. But then why did it feel like something had changed? I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. The night was suffocating, the air still too cold, the whispers too close. I spent the next few days in a daze. I moved around the motel like a sleepwalker, only half aware of my actions. My mind was consumed by one thought. What had I missed? I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and the whispers refused to stop. They were there, in the corners of my thoughts, in the spaces between my heartbeats. They hadn't stopped. They had just become quieter, as though they were biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't stay in the motel forever. I knew that much. But I also knew that returning home to the life I once had would be impossible. The shadows, the feeling of being watched, it would follow me wherever I went. It already had. By the time I decided to leave, I could feel the presence of the watcher growing again, like a storm gathering on the horizon. It was getting closer, drawing near. I packed my things quickly, moving in a blur, trying not to think, trying not to let the overwhelming sense of dread swallow me whole. My mind was already a battlefield, torn between two forces. The overwhelming urge to run and the realization that running had never worked. When I stepped out into the dim light of the parking lot, the silence felt suffocating. The air was thick with the same unease that had followed me since I left 82 Elm Street. I looked around, my eyes darting nervously to the shadows stretching across the pavement. I needed to get away. But the moment I started the car, I heard it again. A faint tapping, barely perceptible but unmistakable. I jerked the wheel to the side, my heart pounding, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Nothing. But it was there again. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the back window of the car. I froze. The tapping grew louder, faster. Then I saw it. A figure in the reflection standing just outside the rear window. My breath caught in my throat. It was the watcher. Its form was distorted, like a shadow stretched too thin, but there was no mistaking it. Its hollow eyes stared back at me through the glass, its mouth twisting into something that could have been a smile. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car screeching as I sped down the road, my hands trembling on the wheel. The tapping stopped, but the presence, asterisk, the weight of it, asterisk, didn't leave. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The watcher was still there. It was always there. I drove for hours, trying to outrun the darkness, trying to outrun the curse that had latched onto me. But no matter how far I went, no matter how fast I pushed the car, I couldn't escape it. The whispers followed me like a storm, swirling around me, filling the car with their low, insistent hum. I couldn't think. My mind was fractured, my thoughts scattered and broken. The road in front of me blurred, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. I was lost. The next morning, I woke up in a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that was barely on the map. My hands were clenched around a cup of coffee, my eyes red-rimmed and tired. I didn't remember driving here. I didn't remember anything after I had left the motel. But the whispers were still there. They had followed me, nestled into the corners of my mind like a disease that couldn't be cured. I could hear them now, growing louder, a constant low hum growing in intensity. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay anywhere. I had tried to escape, but the truth was unavoidable. There was no escape. The watcher wasn't tied to the house. It wasn't bound by walls or doors. It was bound to me. I stood up, my hands shaking as I left the diner. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty street. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a voice, faint, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakable. "You can't run from us." It wasn't the watcher. It was something else. Something even darker, older. It had always been there. I didn't know where to go. But the moment I stepped out into the street, I heard the tapping again. A soft, rhythmic sound. A gentle knock. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was there. And this time it wasn't alone. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing in my ears as I stood frozen on the street. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The figure at the end of the road was still there, its shape barely discernible in the fading light. But there was something else now, a presence beside it. Another shadow, darker and more massive, looming behind the first. The whispers were back, clawing at my thoughts, filling my mind with a sickening sense of inevitability. "You can't escape," the voice echoed again, this time not just in my head but from the air itself. It was all around me, pressing in, suffocating me. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But my legs felt like lead, my body frozen in terror. The street was empty, the world around me silent, save for the faint rustle of wind through the trees and the oppressive presence that hung in the air. The figure at the end of the road stepped forward, moving slowly, its form shifting and distorting as it came closer. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat. And then I saw its face. Or rather, the lack of a face. It was just a black void, an absence of features where a human face should have been, its emptiness staring back at me like a hole in reality. Its body was nothing but a shifting blur of shadows and whispers, and every time I blinked, it grew a little closer. I had seen this before. The Watcher. But this was different. This wasn't just it. This was something far worse, something that had been lying in wait. Something older. And behind it, I saw another figure, even darker, its shape blending with the shadows. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as they drew closer, their presence pushing the air from my lungs. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, like I was sinking into it. The world around me wavered, the edges blurring. "Please," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I just wanted to be free." The figures didn't respond. The first one stepped closer. And the second one. Suddenly I realized what had happened. The house, the curse, the rituals. It wasn't about just one person. It wasn't just about me. The house had been a doorway. A doorway to something far worse. And now, whatever had been waiting on the other side had found its way through. I wasn't the only one to have opened the door. The Watcher had been a part of something bigger, something ancient that had fed on the fears and the souls of everyone who had come before me. It had been watching, waiting. And now it was here. I ran. I don't know how. My legs moved before my brain could process it, my body acting on instinct. The road stretched out before me, the fading daylight casting long shadows across the pavement. I had to get away. I had to leave this place. But the shadows followed me. They were everywhere, suffocating, choking the life out of everything they touched. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the world itself was being swallowed up by the darkness. I heard the tapping again, a soft, rhythmic sound like distant footsteps, but they were getting closer, always getting closer. I turned the corner, stumbling into an alley, hoping to lose whatever was chasing me. But the alley was a dead end. The walls closed in around me, and I knew I was trapped. I looked up at the sky, but it wasn't the sky anymore. It was just blackness, a void stretching above me, swallowing the light. There was no escape. There was no way out. And then I saw it. The door. It wasn't a door in the traditional sense. It was just a frame, an empty space hanging in the air, like a wound torn in the fabric of reality. Behind it was the darkness, an endless expanse that seemed to stretch forever. The Watcher stood in the doorway. Behind it, I could see something moving. Other things, shapes and shadows writhing in the blackness. And there, in the center of it all, was the face. The same face I had seen before. The black void, the absence of all features. But now it was clearer, closer. It was mine. I wasn't just running from the Watcher. I was running from myself. It wasn't just the house that had opened the door. It was me. I had opened it. I had allowed this darkness into my life, and now it was consuming me. There was no escape. No matter how far I ran, the darkness would follow. It would always follow. I stepped forward, my body moving on its own, drawn toward the door like a moth to a flame. The whispers surrounded me, louder now, and I could hear the voice of the Watcher again, but it was different. It was my voice. You can't escape, And then I stepped through the door. I woke up in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were cold stone, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. My limbs were heavy, my body numb, but the whispers were gone. The presence that had consumed me was gone. But the door was still there. It stood open, a black void in the center of the room, calling me. I could feel it. The weight of it, pressing against my soul. The house. The curse. The Watcher. They were waiting. And I knew without a doubt that I would never be free.